What's up, and welcome back to the Relationship School's Smart Couple Podcast. I'm your host, Jayson Gaddis, and I'm grateful to be here bending your ear for a little while. This podcast is for you if you want to have an outstanding, fulfilling long-term relationship that then bleeds into the rest of your relationships. You become the person that's the most empowered in your circle around relationships because you value it the most and you're working on it. So we help you in that area of your life, right? A lot of our episodes weave in everything from brain science to attachment and sexuality and personal experience. So we have just a ton of resources here for you for free. And I just want to thank you, the listener. I ran into one of our listeners here at REI the other day, Dan Morta, came up and said hello. Jayson introduced himself and said, thank you so much for putting out such a kick-ass podcast. So Dan, dude, thanks. I just want to give you a shout out back here on the podcast. That was really a treat. So I always say, if you see me around town and you're local, please say hi. It's so fun for me because I actually don't know I'm talking into a freaking mic, guys. I don't know that I'm talking to lots of people here. So when you come back with some kind of impact, I know that we're making a big difference here. So thanks, Dan. And one quick shout out to a podcast review here on iTunes from The 12 Steps. The 12 Steps says, thanks for all you do. I cried my eyes out the first few episodes. Now I'm stronger than I have ever been. Damn. You're welcome, The 12 Steps. Thanks for listening. And please leave us a review if you can over there on iTunes. Excellent. In this episode, I've got a mentor of mine and someone who I consider a major trailblazer in the field of relationships and brain science, and that's Dr. Dan Siegel. He's been on the podcast before, and this is his second run. Dan was on episode number 158. So if you just go to relationshipschool.net/podcast 158, you'll find episode 1, and I strongly recommend you listen to that episode. These are more technical. They're definitely a little conceptual for some of you who like the more heart-centered, nuts and boltsy kind of episodes. This is, I think, very heart-centered, but it's also technical. We'll just say that, okay? This guy's just a genius in many areas and a bit of a polymath in that he weaves a lot of different sciences and fields of study together to form a consilient view of wellness. So Dan, to me, is just outstanding because he's blazing trails on so many fronts. He really challenges this notion of mental health because the field itself has a hard time defining what that even is. All right, in this episode, we get into all kinds of stuff. We start right out with some heavy questions around stress and health in human relationships, epigenetics, making meaning out of madness. We talk about his 3 pillars of mind training and how that can actually heal disease. I ask him about autoimmune disorders because I have lots of friends who are battling or working with autoimmune disorders right now, and they seem to be on the rise. We talked about the ACEs study for you therapist types who know what that is, and we give some context there. And then I always ask clinicians, now I'm asking, give therapists and healers some feedback. What are we doing well and what are we not doing well? And I always like to take the meta view on where we can improve as practitioners. So this is definitely for clinicians, therapists, coaches, psychiatrists. You're going to like this episode, okay? Okay, this guy's got a giant bio, so I'm not going to read the entire thing. But he is a bit of a beast when it comes to writing books and studying the mind, the brain, the body, and human relationships. And let me just give you a couple nuggets here. He completed his medical degree from Harvard Medical School and his postgraduate medical education at UCLA, where Ellen and I went and saw him speak at the Interpersonal Neurobiology conference recently. His training is in pediatrics and child and adolescent adult psychiatry. He was the recipient of the UCLA Psychiatry Department's Teaching Award and several honorary fellowships for his work as director of their training program in child psychiatry. and infant preschool service. This guy, again, he studies the lifespan of how human beings operate and how they work. He's a distinguished fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. I'm surprised he's not like an outcast there because he challenges psychiatry and Western medicine so much. But apparently a lot of people love him also. He's the medical director of the Lifespan Learning Institute. He founded the Mindsight Institute, and he's written so many books. My personal favorite is The Pocket Guide to Interpersonal Neurobiology. But he's also has written The Developing Mind, which my wife's reading right now. And it's crazy because he has his interns try to find faults with it and try to find things wrong with it so that it can get stronger. This is a man with just incredible integrity. So on and on. So without boring you on his ginormous resume, let's get right to it. Okay, here's Dr. Dan Siegel. All right, welcome to the show, Dr. Dan Siegel.
Hello, it's great to be here with you.
Yeah, good to hang out with you again. Such an honor. I was just saying thanks again for the amazing gathering you had at the Interpersonal Neurobiology Conference there at UCLA. My wife and I went out and heard from you and Antonio and Esther and Stan and Harville and everybody. It was just awesome. So thanks again.
Well, Jason, thanks for being there. It was quite a gathering, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was really helpful for us. So thanks.
Great.
Now, in our first interview, a while back, you talked about, and for the listener, that's episode 158. We talked about the mind, and you unpacked the mind quite a bit. In this interview, with that context already having been built a little bit, I want to go a little further and ask some more questions. And also just, I've been reading your books, and of which you have many, but I've been reading a couple of your books, specifically the Interpersonal Neurobiology Pocket Guide. And I have a few questions about that, as well as some things you said at the conference. So can we dive in?
Absolutely. And so this will be kind of like a part two in a sense. Would you like me to assume that people have heard that before?
Yeah.
Or a little back to catch people up?
Yeah, let's sort of assume the listeners heard that. And if you haven't, then it would be good to go get that episode just for some context, because Dan, rather than him going back into a definition of the mind, I'd rather have you just go listen to that episode.
Great.
Yeah. So at the conference, I'm just going to dive right in with some poignant questions here. At the conference I was just at, you said something to the effect of tolerating ambiguity is the sign of brain health. Now, can you unpack that a little bit? And this is in the context of relationships.
Yes. Well, the quote I think that actually somebody else put up there was saying that the ability to tolerate ambiguity was a sign of brain health. That's what they quoted me as saying somewhere.
Yeah.
And I think the essence of that probably came from a discussion in some lecture I was giving, which was, and I'm trying to remember how far we got in the last time, Jason, you and I did our conversation, but just to give a teeny bit of a review, if the mind is an emergent property of energy, and energy moves from possibility to actuality, then the proposal, that we're wrestling with in this view is that our mental life, our consciousness, our feelings, our thoughts, our memories, things like that, are basically emerging from a fundamental process of the universe that certainly is related to the brain in your head, but as we talked about with Antonio Damasio, it relates to the whole body. And as I tried to show in my discussion with Antonio on the stage there, that it would make sense to look at energy as not just certainly in the head, but not even just in the body, but that what he calls a cultural mind is also something found in the betweenness of energy flow. And so that's why I gave a big, oh my gosh, great to have a fellow traveler who's willing to talk like that. Once you say that, that's about the location of mind. But if you do take that step, that completely reasonable step to take, even though you don't really hear anybody taking it, not even Antonio usually talks about energy patterns. But once you do, then you go into the science of energy, and then you go from this basically physics view of energy, which is the movement from possibility to actuality. And it's from that line of reasoning And then this wheel of awareness practice I do, where I've done this with so many people over this long period of time, that the notion that consciousness itself, the experience of being aware, not what you're aware of, but the process of awareness, being aware, actually emerges from a probability position, which would be in this sea of potential, or in this graph we do, it's the plane of possibility, or in quantum physics terms, it's called the quantum vacuum. It's basically the mathematical space of infinite variety of stuff. It's where all form rests before it becomes form. So it's the potentiality of form from which form arises. So it's the possibility from which all actualities emerge. And so my statement that the person was probably quoting from me was something like, not only tolerating ambiguity, but thriving with uncertainty is a sign of health, because you're dropping yourself into that plane of possibility, that deep source of not only receptive awareness, but all things that might arise without having to control them or fix on only one or another, but actually resting in ambiguity, resting in uncertainty. So that's where I think that phrase comes from.
Okay. And essentially you're kind of also alluding to the 3 pillars of mind training there that you talk about. If we want to be, quote, healthy individuals or beings, we want to have focused attention, open awareness, which is kind of what you're talking about here, and kind intention. Is that right?
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Now, in your book, Interpersonal Neurobiology, you talk about patterns of communication and stress being handed down through generations, through epigenetics, the gametes. I just want to read a short passage and have you comment on why having like a safe adult relationship is so critical to our well-being and our health. Is that all right?
Of course, yeah.
Okay, so you say, for example, the experience of extreme stress in one generation may be passed on through the gametes, the egg and the sperm, such that the ability to regulate stress may be compromised in future generations. These epigenetic changes can directly affect the parts of the central nervous system that control the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal HPA axis, so that the release of the stress hormone cortisol cannot be properly modulated. And then when this occurs, the accumulated effect of stressors called the allostatic load is significantly increased. And you go on basically to say that is really damaging to our health. And you said, again, something at the conference there akin to that. And I really want the listener to get how important it is to learn how to have strong, safe, good adult relationships. Otherwise, they're really negatively impacting their health. Will you say a little more about that?
Oh, absolutely. The first thing to say is that the broad thing everyone should know about is, we're affected by the experiences we have from in the womb on, really. And we come out with kind of an innate proclivity of our nervous system called temperament that's independent of our experiences outside the womb. So you've got temperament, then you have experience, which really means basically how energy and information is flowing through your system, which in this case, we're going to talk about the bodily system, including the brain.
Okay.
And, this is where you heard me in the conference, Jason, talk about the distinction. I think that's important to make, where Antonio Damasio was saying with the term experience, if it's not an awareness, it's not an experience. I would, invite you to consider that, and I said this at the conference, that what he really means is that you need awareness to have subjective experience, the first person texture of lived life, but that you can have energy information flow streaming through let's say your relationships or your body. That's what experience is, energy and information flow, that you're not aware of, but it's an experience that's happening. It's an actuality that has arisen from this pool of possibilities that you're just not aware of. So, so in this sense, your temperament that you're born with, the experiences you have that shape the unfolding circuitry of your brain, will be a combination of ongoing neuroplastic changes, because where energy goes, neural firing flows and neural connection grows. Sometimes that's in consciousness with awareness, called focal attention. Sometimes it's just attention without awareness. because attention is different from awareness. But it's a process that directs energy and information flow. So that's one part of it about it. But the epigenetic issue that you're referring to is this, that depending on the timing, and it gets a little tricky because of when an individual's sperm is developing or when the egg is developing. So it's how this becomes genetically passed is actually complicated in terms of developmental timing, and also gender specific, because eggs develop when the baby is a fetus in the womb, and the sperm mature before puberty in the male. At least that's one way we're thinking of it at this moment. Okay. So if an individual is pregnant with a female fetus and is having stress, like is in a Holocaust or is a slave or is in a famine or something, these major, major stressors, then a female's ovaries will respond when that female's in the womb based on what the mother is experiencing as a stressor. And that's one way of thinking about it. You can look at the studies out of Sweden, which kind of follow these generations across 500 years and can show that, you know, if you're a female and you were in the womb when your mother was under stress, then you will not have the stress of a famine, not have a proclivity to diabetes. But if you have a female baby, she will be, because it was your eggs. Actually, I don't even know if it's female or male. When you have a baby, your offspring will have it. That's the way it is. Because what your grandmother experienced basically is, my God, there's no food around. I better hold on to every calorie I have and let me eat what I can find. Yeah. Well, if you have that epigenetic message that's controlling your brain's approach to metabolism and food acquisition, you'll have a risk of diabetes. And that's what they found, that it skipped a generation, and depending on male, female, offspring, and, you know, and it was your grandmother being under famine. And then there was some implication, and we'd have to look at the current ways of looking at this, because it's hard to look at this, that if you were a male and you went under such a stress pre-pubertally, then it was your offspring that had this risk. So it didn't skip a generation. So it's a very interesting finding, you know. But the bottom line of it is, if your parents or grandparents had major stressors, and, you know, we're talking about, you know, being in the Holocaust is one set of studies, having a famine another. People have told me, but I haven't seen the papers on slavery. You know, these are all massive stresses human beings are under. And in terms of the vigilance you're talking about, you know, it's helpful if you're in a threatening environment to have your brain tuned into things that could hurt you, because there's a lot of them going on and you want to be ready. But if you have a ready brain that's hypervigilant, you know, very focused on danger, but there's not a lot of danger around, you may then overinterpret signals going on. Someone forgets to call you back. Someone's coming home late from work. You know, someone writes you an email that doesn't have the right tone. Whatever, you know, you can have your whole evaluative system be ready to evaluate that as an attack, as a threat, because of what your parents or grandparents went through. Not even necessarily your attachment, which of course can shape that too. So that's the whole idea of epigenetic influence on hypervigilance for danger.
So given that there's some of that generational trauma, let's call it, or extreme stress that maybe our lineage has been through, and then there's these everyday activities and events that could trigger it, like you're saying, aren't there just basic things we can do to help not create more stress in our adult relationships, and actually even maybe heal some of that, so that some of those activated states?
I think the good news about epigenetics is that it's a way the non-DNA molecules sitting on top of our genes are regulating our genetic expression. And so what that means is, if you can do things now in your life, there's every reason to believe that you can modify the regulatory systems in your brain using your mind.
Right.
So whether it's genetic, we think in bipolar disorder, though we don't know for sure, epigenetic, which are these things we're talking about now. The fantastic news about what we know at this moment is that your mind can actually alter the basic processes of the brain. And that means both the state that is created, and then with practice, how the state becomes a trait by changing the structural connections in the brain. So, it's really an exciting moment to answer your question with at least a very affirmative conceptual response, which is, we should be able to modify how we are to create more well-being, even if we've inherited these genetic or epigenetic things that make us more prone to entering the no brain fight, flight, freeze, or faint state.
Yeah, and can we also do that through our perception, changing our perceptions?
Well, that's an interesting question, Jason. What do you mean by changing your perception?
Well, like using the mind, let's say, to change the perception of what the event was. Like, for example, it's not what happened to me, but it's my perception of the event.
Well, if you mean by perception how you make sense of an event?
Yeah, how I make sense of an event.
Okay, so I would use that phrase because finding meaning in madness doesn't mean changing your perception of the madness. It means changing your understanding and the impact of the madness.
Okay.
And so I would be careful because, sometimes let's say someone's a child abuse victim.
Yeah.
And the parent tells them, I didn't sexually abuse you. I didn't sexually abuse you. You're wrong. So they have a lot of abusers trying to change their perceptual memory.
Right.
And so I'm very careful as a therapist not to say, I'm going to change your perceptual memory, because their victimizers, did that to them. So I want them to be with reality, but help change the meaning of the reality in their life. So meaning can change the context, the framing of the meaning. And I think that's what you mean by perception. Like how does the overall sense of this experience that actually happened sit with you now versus how it sat with you when it was unresolved? And so that's a change in meaning making, and it's a change in understanding impact, and so you have an insight into it. It changes your physiological reaction to it. And in all those ways, yes, you could say it's changing your memory of it, because now you're making more sense of it and it's not associated with panic, let's say. But I would just be hesitant to call that it's changing the perception, because that's like...
Yeah, okay, fair enough.
I'm just trying to be really protective of so many people who their life was imprisoned because they couldn't just face the actual perception of what happened, and they're running from it. And a lot of people told them, no, it never happened. So I'm trying to really be very protective of that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Yeah. And so what's the mechanism then that changes the physiology from, let's say, disease to wellness? If I can change how I look at it, and I can change, and I can make meaning of it, what's happening? Like, I just want the listener to understand that no matter what you've been through, you can, due to the brain's plasticity, we can actually move from disease, let's say a dysfunctional gut, for example, into a more healthy, well place. Is that not true?
It's totally true. It's amazingly true. Here's a way to think about it. If you think about what we've just said, that the process of making meaning within yourself, and certainly it's there's a synergistic effect when we make meaning with someone else. So we can talk about the relational side of that too. But just to stay with the meaning side, I always try to remember that word meaning with 5 parts of it. And luckily they're in the sequence of the alphabet. So it's A, B, C, D, E. So it's the A, B, C, D, E's of meaning. So let's go through each of them. And you can see where the phrase making meaning, which is a synonym for making sense, And that's important to realize, because making sense doesn't mean making intellectual. It means sensing it, feeling it, and allowing the meaning to emerge from that sensory experience.
Right.
A lot of times people think it means rationalizing something, and it doesn't.
Yeah, it means feeling it. You're talking about feeling it on a deep level.
And using reason, that's fine.
Okay.
But it isn't about just, intellectualizing something. So even though making sense sounds like it's an intellectual thing, it's actually quite deep, bodily, sensory, emotional journey you're going to go on.
I like that.
So the first is A, okay?
Yep.
So the A is about associations. So before someone does the healing work of making sense, they have lots of associations. Let's talk about sexual abuse, for example. Someone might have, a feeling of panic, or a feeling of shame that they're no good, or a feeling of betrayal that their sexual partner is going to cheat on them, or a feeling of being ugly, or a feeling of being inadequate. All these things can be just immediately they start becoming sexually aroused. They're engaging in foreplay with their partner, and these are the associations in someone with unresolved trauma.
Yeah,
because they made sense of it yet, and we'll come back to what happens once you resolved it. But those associations is the A of meaning.
Okay.
The B is beliefs. So the belief you might have is, I am sexually very unattractive. I don't deserve to be sexually fulfilled. Anyone who's my sexual partner, is just using me. And I'm so damaged, there's no hope for me to ever change this prison I'm in.
Yeah.
So those would be beliefs, right?
Okay.
So you have associations, which are feelings and thoughts and all sorts of things. Beliefs, which are these, basically these mental models you've accumulated over time. That are summaries of things. And the C is cognitions. So cognition just means, like, what are the thought trains? What are the thought patterns? The unfolding of cognition is basically information processing. So it goes something like this. Well, she wants to be sexual with me, but she's only doing that because she can't get anybody else, because I'm really a piece of crap. And therefore, I have to watch for any time she's really not excited about what I do, because she's really just doing this because she wants a place to live, because I have a nice apartment. And, oh yeah, look, she just looked away. That's see right there. That's the proof that she really doesn't like me. Yep. And that gets to my beliefs and my associations, etc. Okay. So that's the cognitions. The D is the developmental period that this all arose. So let's say I was sexually abused when I was a kid, or my aunt was abusive of me sexually, or she told me I was too big or too small, or whatever she might have commented. And I have all these associations, beliefs, and cognitions that happened when I was, between 4 and 7, when my aunt took care of me every weekend or something, because my parents were busy trying to solve their problems or something like that.
Yeah.
So there'll be particular issues being 4 to 7 years of age, when I'm just kind of entering a certain kind of developmental autonomy, as I go out to school and stuff. So that's a D, the developmental period.
Yeah.
And then the E is the emotion. So you could, emotion is a tricky word, and you could see with the discussion with Antonio Damasio,
Yeah, I remember that.
There's a lot we could say about that, but let's just use the word emotion for a kind of, I use the word emotion for a shift in states of integration. And in this case, it would be like, okay, my partner wants to be sexual with me. So at this moment, the emotion that arises is this feeling of real fear, that she's going to hurt me, and maybe a feeling of shame. And so these, of course, are some of the associations that came up, but we talked about the emotional associations. And then when I follow that fear, emotion evokes motion. So it's going to try to evoke in me a behavioral response. So instead of getting sexually aroused with my partner, I start withdrawing in fear. So if it's the fight, flight, freeze, and faint, maybe I feel completely helpless in the faint, or maybe I just freeze up, or maybe I just want to run away, and I get up out of bed, and I'm, now literally going, she goes, "Where are you going?" And I go, I'm just going. So that emotion of fear has now completely taken over and shifted not only the state of integration within me, So now I'm becoming more differentiated. So I'm becoming less integrated with her.
Yeah.
But now I've isolated myself and I entered this rigid state or chaotic state. So, this is where if you do all the A, B, C, D, E's, you can see, Jason, if you were to work with me to make sense of my trauma, I would disentangle the associations, beliefs, cognitions, developmental period, and emotions so I could engage in a fully integrative sexual relationship with my partner.
Right. So I'm going to move out of a chaotic state or a rigid state, you say, on the both sides of either side of the river of integration, and because I want to be integrated so that I can have this healthy relationship with my partner.
Exactly. So when you see emotion as a shift in integration, some emotional states like fear or shame or anger, they decrease our state of integration. Whereas ones of joy and love and awe and gratitude increase our state of integration. So this is the really useful thing for me anyway about defining emotion as a shift in integration, whether it's within the body or in our relationships. And what are classically called positive emotions, like the ones I just listed, love and joy and awe, gratitude, has a sense of connection. It's increasing our state of integration as we join with someone. And that it's what we call, I don't like positive, negative, but that's what the scientists call it. It's this positive emotion, which Barb Fredrickson and I have written about, is an increase in the state of integration. But those uncomfortable emotions that are often called negative emotions or positive, negative, negative emotions, I don't like to use those terms, but they do, are sadness and fear and anger and shame and guilt. Yeah. And all those emotions are decreases in the state of integration. The decreases in complexity that makes you prone to chaos or rigidity.
Yeah. And would you say, this is, I don't want to get too deep on the emotion thing, but would it be fair to say that emotions, because I just heard you basically say emotions in a way mobilize us into action, would you say they're feedback then? Like a feedback mechanism in the body and in the physiology of the way we're wired?
Yeah, it's interesting. If you study, the researchers' work on emotion, they really say this, I think, quite beautifully, although it's not often articulated as clearly as they could, that emotion and emotion regulation are the same thing. So it is a feedback loop. It's always, whenever you talk about emotion, you're talking about its regulation or dysregulation. I mean, so the answer is yes. I mean, it's a feedback loop that allows for at least an attempt at monitoring and modifying something. That's what regulation is monitoring something, modifying it. So that's exactly what emotion is. It's a monitoring and modifying state that has a feedback loop, which is what regulation is, because emotion and emotion regulation are basically the same thing.
Yeah, cool. And like you said, we can do this with ourselves, the regulation, or we can do it with another, right?
Yeah. I mean, this is where, when you saw me on the stage with Antonio Damasio, there was such a big moment when, I knew that he hadn't used energy flow in his writings as a terminology.
Yeah.
Nor did he really say how the cultural mind related to the embodied mind that he was talking about, although he did see the bridge as homeostasis, which is this drive for not just surviving, but thriving and projecting into the future, in terms of like remembering for the future or, reproduction. So I wanted to take it the next step, which is to say, if the cultural mind was the same as relational mind, and he basically said yes. And then if he felt it was reasonable to see that what was shared in common between the relational mind and this fully embodied mind that was not just in the skull was energy flow, and energy in the patterns of symbolism is called information. So you could say energy and information flow. And that's when he said it's completely reasonable to move from biological systems to, chemical and physical systems based on physics. And that's when I went
right.
Full of
he fell over almost. Yeah, that was great.
I mean, let me tell you, Jason, I have not found any academic, short of physicists who don't study the mind or biology, but short of physicists, I just haven't found any common academic, folks to partner up with this. And so I knew he's perfectly capable, because I've seen him do it on stages of telling people he doesn't like what they said and says it in very strong terms,
Yeah.
So I knew that he's perfectly capable of doing that. It's not a pushover by any means. So I knew it was a chance, but I want to just put it out there and say, since energy and information flows in our relationships and it flows in our skull and in our body as a whole, how did he feel about seeing that as the common ground between our relational mind, which he calls the cultural mind, and the embodied mind? And he was completely fine with that. So once you go there, and then it comes back to your question, and this is why I was so excited for the whole weekend we spent together, because I felt like it was a turning point for the whole field of mental health to be able to now say the mind is embodied, it's not enskulled, and it's relational, it's not just embodied. And we can stop fighting about that, because everyone gets all upset. It's not just in the head, And then once we go there, then your question is a very natural question to answer. Emotion as a part of our mental life is fully embodied and fully relational. Why? Because it has to do with shifts in integration that are within and between. And when you look at integration as the fundamental process that's necessary for self-organization, then you come back to the definition we talked about last time, which is the mind is this emergent, self-organizing, embodied relational process. And then because integration is what optimizes self-organization, then you can see where regulation, which is what the self-organizing process is doing, can happen within and between. And then it's not really magical. It's just really natural that the skin and skull are not boundaries for energy and information flow. And I understand nobody talks like this. My interns cannot find anybody else who talks like this. But that's why I was so thrilled to have 3 hours on stage with Antonio Damasio, who's as rigorous a thinker in these things as you can get, and just lay it out, what we say in interpersonal neurobiology, and see if he would just say, something, this is pretty stupid. Because I knew he could say that, but he didn't at all, So it was pretty thrilling for me.
Yeah, that was got to be a cool moment for you. I just appreciate your trailblazing there, because I think it's pretty hard for people to grasp. I would imagine. I'm not in the scientific field, but I like your rigor with and your stalwart sort of commitment to educating people really about the mind and mental thing.
Well, Jayson, I appreciate that because, and it's my stalwart commitment. I love that phrase. I've never heard that said about me before, but that's how I feel. I feel like, when I was in training as a medical student, this reductionistic view of mind as just brain activity allowed physicians who are teachers and my colleagues who are physician students to basically see emotions and meaning as meaningless because they were doctors of the physiology of the body.
Yeah.
And it just didn't matter, this quote subjective experience. And yet, as I mentioned this, you can tell me, I don't remember. But, when I was in college studying biochemistry, at the same time I was on a suicide prevention service, and I was taught that, listen, someone's going to kill themselves and you're on the phone with them on a suicide phone line. The way you tune into the subjective experience is the difference between life and death. So for me, I knew from repeated experience as a suicide crisis phone call handler, whatever you call that person, that, hey, subjective experience may have the word subjective in front of it, but it doesn't mean it's not real.
Yeah.
It just means it's felt deeply, and it may not be measurable with numbers.
Well, anyone that understands, that lives inside of a marriage understands that subjective experience is real. If you really validate your partner's emotions, for example, as real, it doesn't mean right or wrong. It just means they're real. That's really, that feels really good to be validated in one's experience.
It's really good. And you've just described the most important part, I think, about absolutely, long-term committed relationships, but any relationship really.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. All right, smart couple listeners, here's a quick interruption from the Relationship School. As you know, we run a 9-month training to help you get the class you never got in school so that you can live an empowered relational life. And it's amazing what this does for folks. Here's Allie, who was at our conflict weekend and who is doing the 9-month training. And this is Allie's first experience with us, and it was the first weekend. So this is what she had to say.
Well, I found the community here to be really open and really easy and actually very welcoming, which I was really thankful for, being anxious about it. And my partner gave me great advice when I was on the fence about it, and he was like, you have to realize that spending money on yourself and your self-growth is worth it, and you're worth it, and you're going to grow from this. And I was like, yeah, all right, that sounds good.
There you have it. Great advice from her partner, right? It's so worth it, guys, to invest in yourself. This might be one of the greatest investments you have of your life. Imagine if you did your patterns differently and you had people in your life that had your back and you knew how to listen until people understood, and you were the person people went to with their relational challenges because they knew that you got it. You figured this part of your life out. Okay, go to relationshipschool.net/DPIR to apply. All right, back to Dr. Dan Siegel. A few more questions. Why, this is sort of out of left field, but I just want to get your take because it's a lot of my friends struggle with autoimmune disorders, and it seems to be they're super on the rise and prevalent right now. What's going on here? Why are autoimmune disorders, diseases so common now? Why not 100 years ago?
Yeah, I know. There's a couple of things just to consider. I mean, one is I'm very taken by the recent research, like in the last 5 years, on the intestinal role in inflammation. And I think that the shift in the foods we eat, and especially being exposed to substances that are from genetically modified organisms like wheat, that produced the molecular structure, let's say the gluten in wheat, that is now so much more complex than anything we ate 100 years ago, just to try to help grow wheat that wouldn't be devoured by pests. So you can understand the good intentions behind it. But when you stick that stuff in the gut, for some of us, I'm one of those people, for example, the body can't digest that very complex protein. And so it sticks onto the surface of the intestines. And then what happens is the immune system sees that glob that's attached to the outside of the lining of the intestinal cell. And it starts to attack not only the gluten, but also the protein that's on the membrane of the cell.
Yeah.
Well, these antibodies now have been basically primed to try to protect the individual from this poison that you keep on eating with all this bread and that gluten stuff. Believe me, because I'm gluten-free now. So to try to eat without eating gluten, you'd be amazed how that stuff is in everything. Yeah. Genetically modified, complex gluten that probably a third of us cannot digest. Well, what that does is it creates an autoimmune problem, because now your inflammatory system says, I have to attack this thing, and this thing actually is your body.
Yeah.
And, Emmer and Mayer writes about this, David Perlmutter writes about it, that the impact of alterations, not just from gluten substances, but from alterations from taking antibiotics in the distribution of certain bacteria that protect the lining of your intestines. And when you have the bad bacteria that now dominate after taking, let's say, for sinus infection or another kind of upper respiratory tract infection, we frequently take that without taking probiotics, and your foods are diminished in probiotics generally, and also prebiotics that the probiotics need to eat on. Those are really low in our common diet. Mm-hmm. So the dietary change in the biome, the bacterial composition of the intestines, is a setup for autoimmune diseases. That is, for creating inflammation. And the inflammation then alters the brain.
Yeah.
So there are all sorts of brain disorders, including dementia and other forms of diseases, like some suggest Parkinson's. And even some studies now, some preliminary individual reports are suggesting certain cases of autism can be cured by changing the biome. So there's a direct link, and that's what Emmer and Mayer's really excellent book is. There's a direct link between the change in our diet and the exposure to antibiotics, the change in the composition of the bacterial populations in our intestines, and inflammation and its impact on, the heart, on our metabolism, on the brain.
And wouldn't you say, Dan, also if we throw in, just why not throw into the mix adverse childhood conditions and going into chaos or rigidity in terms of being a little infant or a toddler in a family that's a little intense or where there's a lot of neglect, and we add kind of allostatic load or relational stress or something to that. Doesn't that also compromise?
Yeah, so let's look at that. So Nadine Burke-Harris just put out a book called The Deepest Well, and she and I were teaching at a conference, and I think it's a great summary of Vincent Feliti's initial study with his colleagues at Kaiser on what's called adverse childhood experiences. And that's called the ACEs study, ACE, adverse for A, childhood for C experiences. So this is a very concerning study for a number of reasons. And I'll just say the positive side to it is we need to realize that though what I'm about to say is extremely worrisome, there's every reason to have a lot of hope that if you take a lot of what we're saying on this this podcast to heart and do some of these things, that you can reverse the impact of these adverse childhood experiences that I'm about to summarize, because likely the mechanisms by which having cumulative adverse experiences, so of course they can be abuse and neglect, but they can also be where parents have domestic violence, or there's a divorce, or there's drug abuse. So it's a range. And unfortunately, what the studies show is that the higher your score, the more medical diseases you're going to have and the shorter life you'll have. And so people who hear this freak out. And I say to them immediately, and I said this to Vincent Feliti, those studies do not look at individuals who are trying to heal the trauma. They do not look at interventions to try to reverse those effects. They're just epidemiological studies saying we should try to prevent abuse, which is absolutely true. Try to prevent neglect, absolutely true. Try to prevent these adverse experiences, absolutely true. And it's also a call, and this is why Nadine Burke-Harris's book is so important and timely. We have to support people, especially if they have high ACEs scores, in doing the mind practices that with each of the things I'm going to suggest is the likely mechanism for these increases in medical problems. You can reverse every one of those. Yeah. Every one of those you can reverse.
That's so cool, right? That's like the bad news followed by the good news.
The good news, and of course, it should get you motivated.
I agree. Yeah.
If you know my ACEs score is 4 or higher, then you want to listen to Jayson, and you want to say, okay, actually, this is not an option. I've got this score. When I just go online, you can get the ACEs thing, or go to Nadine Burke-Harris's beautiful book, The Deepest Well. You do the study. If it's high, don't freak out. Just get focused.
Yeah.
So the 3 pillars that Jayson talked about: focused attention, open awareness, kind intention. Here's the way those things, in general, we haven't done, let's do a bunch of people with ACEs scores this high. Let's do these 3 pillars of mind training. Now let's see the outcome. We haven't done that. We've just done, here are the 3 pillars. Here's the outcome. And then we have, here's the ACEs score. Here's the outcome. We need to combine those 2 things. So I'm just saying that study has not been done yet. But there's every reason in the world to think that the following mechanisms are both what's improved with the pillars of mind training work, because the research shows that, and those are likely the reasons the ACEs impacts are so negative. And here's how it goes. Number 1, cardiovascular factors, right? Your blood pressure, the way your heart is coordinated with your brain, your cholesterol levels. That's just the cardiovascular system. If you're under a lot of stress, those things are not ideal. They're bad. And you're going to get heart disease. So amazingly, the 3 pillar training improves those. Yeah. So number 1, cardiovascular factors. Number two, your immune system. You have stress, your immune system suffers. You do 3 pillars training, research shows your immune system improves. So the immune system helps you fight disease. Number 3, inflammation. Many of the diseases that are what the ACEs high scores lead to are inflammation related. Mm-hmm. Now that's really important to note that, because we know with the 3 pillars training, you can actually change the epigenetic regulation of inflammation to reduce inflammation in the body. That's been shown with 3 pillar training.
Cool. Yeah.
So ACEs leads to high inflammation. We have the antidote, right? Fourth thing. The fourth thing is when you have the stress of a high ACEs score, and this is in this incredible book called The Telomere Effect by Alyssa Epel and Elizabeth Blackburn. So Elizabeth Blackburn won the Nobel Prize for discovering this system of the caps on your chromosomes. So those are called telomeres. And let's say, just for the sake of our discussion, you have 100 of them, right? Now you need those caps on it, kind of like the cap on a shoelace, so that when you try to put that shoestring, through the little eyelet, if you don't have the cap on there, it's hard to do, right? It just kind of splays out all over the place.
Yeah.
Well, your cells divide to keep themselves refreshed. They've got to unwind the double helix DNA where your genes are. And it's basically like constantly having to restick the string through the eyelet, right? So if you don't have those caps on the chromosomes, your genes get messed up, your cells get messed up, your cells get sick, you get really unhealthy, and you die.
Yeah.
Okay, so you need your telomeres.
Yeah.
So stress and high ACEs scores lead to a reduction in the number of telomeres and a sub-optimization of the enzyme that repairs and maintains those ends of the chromosomes called telomere ACE, which is pronounced telomerase. Now, amazingly, what Alyssa Epel has shown with Elizabeth Blackburn is that you do the 3 pillars training and you optimize telomerase levels so that you not only maintain your telomeres, you can repair them.
It's huge.
So that's a fourth way. And then the fifth way, I'll just add this in there, is, at least in the case of abuse, we know abuse and neglect, developmental trauma, which is one example of ACEs. It's not the only way you get a high ACEs score, but it's one of the ways. That leads to decreased integration in the brain. Now, integration means linking different parts. The reason linking different parts is so important is it allows the brain to be coordinated and balanced, and it's the basis for all forms of regulation. When your brain is not integrated, you are dysregulated and stress ensues and dysfunction ensues. You go into chaos or rigidity. Over the long run, that's going to be really bad for your body and your mind and your relationships. Okay. Now, the 3 pillars training increases integration of the brain. The exact areas, and for those who like to know the areas, what Marty Teicher at Harvard University showed, here are the ways the brain is compromised with the high ACEs event of developmental trauma, abuse and neglect. The corpus callosum, which links the differentiated left and right hemisphere to each other. The hippocampus, which links differentiated memory systems to each other. The prefrontal cortex behind your forehead that links the higher to the middle to the lower areas to the body and to the social world. That is compromised. And there's a study now called the connectome, a set of studies of these more subtly differentiated and linked areas of the brain called the connectome. What trauma does is make the connectome less interconnected. Now, you're not going to believe this, Jayson. I review this in my next book, Aware, so you can see all this stuff outlined there. The 3 pillars training, what it does is it grows your corpus callosum, it grows your hippocampus, it grows your prefrontal cortex, and it makes the connectome more interconnected. And I'm not kidding.
That's so
Is
cool.
that mind-blowing?
Yes, it's mind-blowing. And it's mind healing. I mean,
And it's
not just
exactly.
mind blowing.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is why I say, whenever people want to talk about the ACEs thing, I say, don't get futile, get focused, get hopeful, not hopeless, because we are at a point in the research now, maybe not 15 years ago, it would have been like waving our hands. But now we are really clear. Here's what the trauma does, and here's what the 3 pillars training does. We haven't put them together. I appreciate that's going to be a long-term study. Don't wait for that study to be done. I bet a lot of money that we're going to be able to show that you have a high ACEs score, you do the 3 pillars training, you're going to reverse these factors that are how the ACEs experience has made your life threatened by what happened to you.
Super cool. I want to add one bullet point below the 3 pillars of mind training, and then you can tell me where it fits in. I think it fits in the 3rd category under kind intention.
That's the 3rd of the pillars.
Right, which is the 3 pillars, just so everybody knows, are focused attention, open awareness, and kind intention or compassion.
Yep.
And I want to throw in relationships, like somehow healing adult relationships. Where would that fit in? Would that fit in compassion in the 3rd pillar?
Well, when you say healing adult relationships, tell us what you mean by that.
I mean getting in relationships that are good for you, that are growthful and safe and connected and integrated and co-regulatory, and where we, in a way, repair whatever happened to us as a kid. We're learning how to figure out a new way as adults relationally, which lowers our stress, lowers the cortisol. I'm guessing is better for our brains. So I'm just throwing that out there as maybe a 4th pillar. I don't know.
Yeah, here's what I think is a way to think about that, and it's a beautiful way you're saying it, is if you think about everything you just said, Jayson.
Yep.
When you're in a healing relationship, the way you're beautifully describing it, you are focusing your attention on your partner's subjective internal experience in the present moment, right?
Okay.
You are opening your awareness to let be whatever is with him or her, right?
Uh-huh.
And you are bringing love and kindness and compassion and care and concern and empathy to that connection, right?
Okay.
So everything you described about a healing relationship would be the relational mind training with the 3 pillars. It would be the exact same pillars.
Okay,
you see?
cool.
Because those 3 things are not just, I'm sitting on the cushion doing this. It's this beautiful, and this is where, when you realize the mind is, and this is why I did this with Antonio Damasio, the mind is within and between. It's the same mind, you see.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to work at the withinness of the 3 pillars and the betweenness of the 3 pillars. That's exactly the way to think about it.
That's super cool. Thanks. I needed that little tweak there, and it all just clicked for me. Yes. Yeah. Awesome. Well, I know you're so relational, Dan, and you include, what I love about your work is you include relationships in everything you teach. So it's just goes without saying that it would be in there.
Yeah. And this was, in the Aware book, what I was drawing on was the empirical research on the 3 pillars, which is really fantastic. Almost all of that, not all of it, but almost all of it is the interiority of the mind. It's meditative solo practices. But in my experience as an attachment researcher, for example, those 3 pillars are essential for secure attachment.
Yeah.
And then as a parent-child, researcher myself, I extend that when I think about my own relationships with people, adult to adult, or my adult children, or whatever, or my romantic partner, or whatever. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
And so for me, as a clinician, as an attachment researcher, I want to really honor the actual empirical research. The 3 pillars comes from solo interiority meditation practices. Yeah. But then if you make it relational, to me, it's identical.
Cool. That sounds great.
Yeah.
Okay. 2 last minute questions. Can I ask you 2 more questions that you can only get a minute to answer?
Okay, I'll try.
Okay. The first one, as I always like to ask therapists, psychiatrists, anyone in your seat, if you were to give therapy some feedback, therapists, like where is therapy as a field falling short and what is it doing well? Like just a super short answer of where are therapists falling short and where are they doing well?
Yeah, the falling short part, I think, is where we as a field, it's not the therapist's fault by any means, but we as a field, have been so focused on disorder, that we've lost sight of the deeper processes of well-being that can sometimes be challenged. And so, of course, people come in with suffering. But I think that's the biggest problem. Related to that, of course, is the fact that the field of mental health doesn't have a definition for the mental or the health. So it's a little goofy, right, that we have a field called mental health and we don't deal with saying what the mind is.
Right. No,
right?
different. Yeah, totally.
So that's what I've been working on for so long. And then your question is, what are we doing right? I think when you look at the meta-analyses that are summarized beautifully by John Norcross on, when you accumulate all those studies, controlled studies of psychotherapy, what's really, really effective. What Norcross has beautifully shown is it's all about relationality. Now, people call those the non-specific effects, and as he beautifully points out, they're actually quite specific. It's just that they are part of effective psychotherapy across every modality.
Yeah.
And so that's what they're called non-specific, but they're actually quite specific, as John points out. So we're doing that really well. I think we've got into terminology wars and turf battles that, we don't need to do. And part of why I've kept interpersonal neurobiology as a framework for understanding the mind and mental health away from becoming a form of therapy, because everyone asks us to do that, and I've refused, because we need to have some grounding in this multidisciplinary scientific framework that is inviting every approach to healing to join together in a collaborative way. There is plenty of suffering in this world, and there is no need for turf battles.
Yeah.
We need to unite. And, we now have over 65 textbooks in this series that I started on interpersonal neurobiology. And the idea there is, let's come together rather than split apart so that we can try to bring compassion and kindness and integration into the world.
Yeah, super cool. I really appreciate, I think that was a good move on your part, by the way, to not get into the therapy world and stay a multidisciplinary, group of people that are actually looking at this objectively. It seems really wise to me.
Our accountants think it's dumb, because we can't sell ourselves as like a particular methodology. But in the larger view of the field, I think we have needed this. And I really felt this weekend, that we moved to a new chapter where we really can say the mind is absolutely relational and embodied. And let's get to work on realizing it's not even just our relationships with other people, it's a relationship with the planet.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
We are a human family, and we need to deal with the embodied and relational implications of that and take responsibility and the privilege as mental health professionals of bringing more health into this important moment in human history.
Yeah, agreed. Wow. Okay, last question, Dan, before we let you go is, as you know, I started the relationship school, really trying to reach the planet, helping people with their relationships, particularly love relationships and long-term relationships, because that seems so hard for people. And we want to reach young people, teens and young adults. And I asked you this before, I believe, but just want to hear whatever you would say right now, which is if I had a room full of 1,000 kids, young teens, and I was teaching them something about relationships, what would be the one thing you would want me to impart to them?
Well, in my brainstorm book, I try to invite them to realize that they have this incredible possibility of learning about the nature of the mind and actually shaping the development of their brain. That adolescence is this wonderful opportunity full of changes, where I talk about the essence, this emotional spark and social engagement and novelty seeking, creative exploration, and that they can take this on and make their lives, more integrative. And, in the end, what I say to them is, they're not just the wax of a candle, they're also the flame. Mm-hmm. And, we need to approach our movement forward in humanity with adolescents really having this incredible both opportunity and, responsibility to consider, that by putting the self only in the body, kind of like the wax of a candle that's separate, and not realizing how deeply interconnected we are, which is really what deep science tells us, how deeply interconnected we are. We get this illusion of our separateness, and it's that illusion of a separate self that is a toxic lie in contemporary society that is killing us. And the good news is adolescents are in this wonderful position to realize that they are the light as well as the wax. So they take care of their body, they sleep their body, they exercise their body, that's the wax part. But they're also the light, and anything they can do to light up each other's wicks and to bring more love and care and kindness, bring more light into this world, it's going to be a win-win thing. And I end by telling them that they're not just a me, they're also a we, but to put them together, you're a we, an MWE. And that is where you embrace the wax and the light. And that's a way to make it a brighter world.
Yeah, beautiful. Thanks, Dan. Okay, people can find you at drdansiegel.com. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, and tons of books. Dan's got so many books for parents, for kids, for adults, for kind of science nerds. He's got a huge spectrum, and I recommend his audio stuff as well. So thanks again, Dan, for all that you do. Really, seriously, blazing trails. I'm really grateful I feel like I'm standing on, shoulder of a giant when you share your wisdom, and we get to go out and disseminate some of what you've taught to other people.
Oh, that's great, Jason. Well, where this is a collaborative effort, and thank you for all the work you're doing. It's a MWE process,
Yeah, totally. So, I'm into the MWE process for sure.
Good to be on the journey with us.
Yeah, so good. Okay, thanks again, Dan.
Be well.
You too.
Thank you.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye. Bam. Don't get futile, get focused, folks. Don't get hopeless, get hopeful. All right, so what Dan is saying here is no matter what you've been through, if you do what he calls these 3 pillars training, which to me is basically, we summed it up there near the end, which is get in a healing relationship. Have the kind of focused attention on your partner. You listen to their internal subjective experience in a way that they feel safe and understood by you. Have the kind of open awareness that is an open mind. You're open to differing perspectives, a different point of view, that your way is not always right. And be kind with your intentions and care about them and care about the relationship. When you do those 3 things in what I'm calling a healing relationship and a healing adult relationship, folks, you can heal your past. And as we got a little technical there, the telomeres change, your cells start to change. So this is very, very powerful. So what's your action step? Your action step is to make 100% certain that you get in at least one healing relationship, and you make it explicit. That with your adult partner or future partner, that look, part of what we're doing here is we're healing. We're integrating. We're moving towards integration in ourselves. We're becoming an empowered human being. That is why I am such a huge fan, guys, of relationship. Because relationship itself with awesome people is healing. It's reparative. It's integrative. So this is why doctors who focus on the relationship get better results than doctors who just go in and out of see patients and are completely emotionally guarded and don't give a shit about their patients. All right, my friend Will Vanderveer studies this stuff. So, care about other people, care about yourself. You're going to have a healing experience over time. Who doesn't want that? All right. Now, if you want to take this to the next level, of course, this is the place. This is one place, is the relationship school. Come hang out with us. Come play with us. Apply to the deep psychology of intimate relationships. We go over this stuff, actually, in a less technical way. And we learn how to have healing, empowered adult relationships over time. Because, man, when you've got that going in your life, the rest of your life is better because you've got a secure home base, an anchor, someone who has your back to come home to at night when you feel beat up on the battlefield of life, right? So double down, guys, on your relational investment right now and consider coming to the Relationship School. Go to relationshipschool.net/DPIR if you want to apply. All right, we're taking applications now. The early bird price is on, and you can get in and join us. All right, it's going to be a really good time. We start in the fall. We start in September, but make the commitment now. Look into this now and apply now. relationshipschool.net/DPIR. All right, everybody. Thank you. And again, I can't believe that I get to talk to people like Dan Siegel. I'm so grateful that I get to not only talk to him, but then share it with you all. So I hope this serves, and we'll talk soon.